This week's episode of The Clear Out was recorded on the 4th of April 2022 at home in Wicklow. And it begins as a reflection, I suppose, on what the best approach to contentment is, the best pathway to a sort of a personal resolution or accommodation with life and existence is, with reference to the self. And this was brought about by a discussion I was having with my cousin here at #blessed, and basically we were debating whether the better road is to lean into the self and go deep and wallow and explore and excavate and understand and unpack and then resolve that way, or if there is a much more concentrated attempt to achieve the removal of self, a sort of a healthful eradication or erasure of self, to sort of anonymize oneself and give oneself over to life with a sort of a very positive passivity and radical acceptance, rather than a determination to try and control everything and to drive one's sense of purpose from an egotistical or egoistic point of view. So that is really the beginning of the discussion in this week's episode. But what I really end up focusing on is how, regardless of the philosophical nature of that and how it fits into maybe psychology and wellness approaches, I conclude quickly that we are all fascinated by individuals, in terms of the stories we consume and the art we consume particularly. We love seeing our humanity reflected at us through other individuals, or seeing aberrations of humanity in the individual, and we like historical figures of exceptionalism, and we're drawn to deep studies of self as it exists in other characters. And so the episode really goes into in my opinion, three great examples of examination of self from the movies. Two perhaps more obvious than others, but three great movies in their own right, and three movies that are narratively driven by, or certainly borne witness by, the self of the characters in question. So that's what's coming. Some in-depth movie talk on the back of the starting point, and I think it's good stuff. It's particularly good stuff if you like movies, and these movies cover quite a time span. The first one goes back to the 70s, and the most recent is just from a few years ago. So start listening to find out what they are, and I'll see you there real soon. Cheers.
Ooh, not gonna change my mind, leaving the dream behind.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear, and you're listening to The Clear Out. Welcome to it. How's it going? How's she cutting, as they like to say round these parts? How is she cutting? They're not talking about your axe or your chainsaw or your steak knife. They're talking about life. They're talking about your existence. How is your existence slicing through the chaos of life? How is your existence cutting through the BS, the big system? There you go. So here you are. Welcome to The Clear Out. And if you haven't been here before, this is a podcast dedicated to explorations of wellness via many different things, but often pseudo-psychology, philosophy, movies, and personal storytelling, sometimes of a confessional nature. And the attempt to draw connections, to lay down a matrix of connectable, understandable, workable, life-solving resources or approaches or questions that can be wrestled with in a satisfactory way. That's the basic thrust. Is that a mouthful? I think it was. I think it is. And it will continue to be. Anyway, so be it. So there you go. That's where we're heading in a broad sense. Specifically, I have some very specific areas to look into today, inspired by my weekend's movie watching. I'm recording this on a Monday morning. Very unusual time slot for me to be sitting down at the mic, but I'm looking at a busy-ish week and some other things have dropped into my schedule, so this is the time to strike the iron. It's hot and I'm striking it. I just put up some photos of my chickens. Have you seen my chickens? I put up a couple of photos on Instagram there of the chickens from last week. Some early morning shots. The chickens silhouetted against the morning landscape, not fully against the sky. And in one of them, the rooster, the notorious randy half-Mexican rooster who goes by the name of Edwina. In one of them, Edwina's body shape as he perches atop a fence post is beautifully echoed by the tops of the trees beneath him in the background. It's quite a nice thing. Just naturally presented itself. The chickens, they kind of drive me mad. They have a sort of a coldness. I mean, I've spoken about this before in an earlier podcast. That cold reptilian eye of birds, I think actually quite brilliantly evoked, not in Hitchcock's The Birds, although very brilliantly and horrifically deployed there, but actually in Pixar's A Bug's Life, which, gosh, that must be 20 years old at this stage, is it? It was one of the earlier, not long after Toy Story efforts, wasn't it? In any case, A Bug's Life, there are a couple of sequences in A Bug's Life that feature, in stark contrast to the majority of the bugs, the insects, the ladybirds, the ants, the praying mantis, the caterpillar, all those characters, and even the baddies, the locusts, as led by a very sinisterly voiced Kevin Spacey. All those characters in A Bug's Life are drawn for comic effect. They're clearly cartoon characters, and there's lots of natural humour in the way they're depicted. Cartoonish, and it's a cartoon movie, of course. But there is a bird that features at two key moments in the story. And the bird, of course, is a predator of all these insects. And the bird is not drawn in a cartoonish way. The bird is drawn in a very naturalistic way. And the mechanical compulsion or the mechanical staccato rhythm of the bird preying on insects is actually used to quite terrifying effect in the story. There are a couple of one scary locust who's like a rabid dog in the Kevin Spacey camp, and that locust character is used to be scary and used to scary effect. But the bird, ironically, the one character in the whole story that's not depicted in a cartoonish way, is genuinely sort of chilling, because there's no caricature, there's no exaggeration, and there's a sort of remorselessness and a pitilessness to the bird that, and that's why I use the word mechanical. The the bird preying on the insects is quite vicious, and that's what I identify in the chickens as well. The 3 chickens here, who I think they're the accounting department, aren't they, for the podcast? The finance department. You know, the eggs is the metaphor, isn't it? Eggs equals money. But you watch those chickens live their lives, and yeah, it's like they've got this mad radar for where they can strike and attack food, whether it's birdseed that falls from the bird feeders in the plum tree, or I have, over their time here, found little dead animals, like a dead baby mouse. You know, no fur on that guy, just pre-fur, but got by the chickens. I found a song thrush, a beautiful speckled thrush up near the hen coop the other day, and that looked like the victim of a chicken attack. And then yesterday we found an ailing, it looked like a juvenile bullfinch, had that lovely sort of peachy pinky chest, so not the full flush of colour that you'd see in an adult male, but somewhat, you know, a somewhat muted version, not fully developed yet. And this guy was kind of trying to hide in a hole in the stone wall in the garden, and I reckon he'd been got by the chickens as well, and we tried to save him, but he didn't even make midnight last night. He was gone before bedtime. So my daughter had christened him, she'd christened him Calvin. Oh, I know why, because I mentioned a Calvin and Hobbes, the Bill Watterson cartoon strip, and Calvin, he's a character I always feel I can identify with. He's kind of an agent of chaos, a wild child. I don't think I was as megalomaniac, megalomaniacal as Calvin was as a kid, but I certainly recognised the hyperactivity and the vivid world of the imagination. But on the flip side, Calvin has this amazingly sincere relationship with nature, and frequently he and his pet tiger Hobbes recline under the shade of a tree, or just are enjoying the great outdoors. And I remember there was a strip there where an injured bird was rescued but died, and it was a very poignant moment in the Calvin and Hobbes journey. So in any case, I mentioned that last night, and I think that's why my daughter christened this now departed bullfinch Calvin. So Calvin the bullfinch is no more. And just to add to this kind of projected darkness onto the chickens, I referred in the last episode to the busyness of Edwina the rooster at the moment, and how he has been foisting himself upon his 2 female companions several times a day, it would seem. And so the two female chickens are white. They're little white bobble-headed things. I think they're are they Polish? Yeah, I think there's a Polish connection. And they're not silkies, are they? They're something else. But they've got these little kind of bobble pom-pom heads. And then the rooster is more conventionally rooster-looking, except almost entirely black, with his is it a coxcomb? Is that what it's called? What's the kind of ripply, kind of gross bit that sits on top of the head? You know what I'm talking about. That kind of ridged bit. Is that the comb? Anyway, there's that little flash of colour, and then there's a bit of a shiny dark green around the tail feathers. Fine, kind of cool looking, but I tell you, when he gets on top of one of those chickens and he spreads his feathers like a black cloak over the subject of his attentions, or the object of his attentions, it's vampiric in appearance. And it was my wife who pointed it out, and I was like, oh, it's kind of creepy. And it was then I just kind of got that kind of Nosferatu kind of flash, just the vampire's cloak wrapping around the victim. And it also brought to mind that brilliant scene, chilling scene from Neil Jordan's Interview with a Vampire, his adaptation of the Anne Rice novel from, I guess, the mid-90s. That must have been around 94. And probably one of Tom Cruise's first departures from his conventional hero mold, to play quite a camp, effete, vampire, guiding. He was Lestat, wasn't he? And he was guiding the young novice vampire, the beautiful Brad Pitt. Was he Louis? Into the world of eternal life. But there's a haunting scene, a haunting sequence in the middle of that movie where the guys end up, I think it's in Paris. Would it be Paris? Or they're international travelers? Because they're definitely in New Orleans at some point. In any case, they're in a theatre, and it's an audience of mortals watching, and it's like a vampire theatre, and a woman walks up on stage, and she's naked, and from above we just see this circle of vampires just descend on her at speed, and she's completely enveloped as they sort of devour her underneath their cloaks. And the effect is, of course, very animalistic and terrifying, and it's just done so well. I mean, there's a snake-like, rat-like, verminous, multiple swarming kind of effect to it that's really unnerving. Neil Jordan, he can tap into something, can't he? Anyway, now there you go. So that's just on the chickens. The mention of Interview with the Vampire presents the opportunity to talk about one of the actors I want to talk about today, which is Kirsten Dunst. Kirsten Dunst first came on my radar in Interview with the Vampire as the child vampire who was eternally young, because at the time at which she became a vampire, the age at which she became a vampire was the age at which she remained for the rest of her vampire life. And so she was this child figure, but a much older person inside, and used her childish appearance and childish guiles and apparent innocence to attract and seduce her victims, even though she was an adult inside and couldn't really enjoy adult pleasures. And so there was just a brilliant performance by this child actress, a great sort of knowingness and sophistication and layering of the character, and I just thought she was brilliant, and I was and have been a fan ever since. She, to me, I was thinking about it before recording today. I was thinking she's, and it maybe in recent years as she's shifted into more mature characters, it's less. She's using this natural thing she has much less, but she is a naturally luminous performer, and she has never, I felt, she's never been a highly sexualized performer, which is probably a little bit unusual for an attractive young Hollywood actress. She is, I think, very attractive, but she has always had this kind of inner light in her work, I feel. There's just been, and there's a lightness to her acting. And yeah, she was the main actress in one of 3 movies I watched this weekend, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But let me just do a little bit of preamble to set the sort of the broader topic of what I'm talking about. So I was having a chat with my cousin here at #blessed, and we were just having one of those general existentialist, how do you cope with life, and how do you cope with what life throws at you kind of chats, and discussing kind of Buddhist concepts and other existentialist approaches, and looking at Western duality, and discussing the rights and wrongs of placing oneself at the center of the frame and at the center of the story. And like this is a theme that I have touched on several times before. If you've listened to the podcast, you'll have heard me speaking about the great benefits, I believe, of being able to let yourself go, of letting yourself be an object rather than dwelling in the subjective in a compulsively egotistical way. And I'm not saying egotistical I'm not loading that with any massive negative connotation there, but I have discussed this idea of if we can relax and deepen and trust ourselves and trust that we know ourselves, we can be a lot less anxious about how we travel in the world and how we're perceived by the outer world and what our engagements are with others and with the world around us. And if we recognize ourselves more from a witnessing point of view, or a distanced perspective, where we see we're just another entity, we're just another life form, another organism, and try to lower the stakes and take a bit of heat out of the great I, the great me, the great I am, the great I want, the great I need to, I should. All those big capital I's, all those first person understandings of existence can often be unhelpful and can leave us in a sort of locked in a cell of self out of which we struggle to escape. And this was part of the discussion I was having with my cousin yesterday, and we were just questioning where the better path lies, and leaning into more the Buddhist detachment sort of idea, the removal of self, not obsessing about good, bad, that endless sort of dichotomizing that we're conditioned to do in the West, where it's sort of often a zero-sum game. I'm either this or I'm that, rather than looking at the multifaceted, multivalenced, multi-layered expression and the multi-layered kind of experience of being human, and looking at that in a very accepting way, in a way of sort of very, what I think of as very benign and consistent acceptance, which is a far cry from the general thrust of a lot of sort of pop psychology and pop wellness advice that prevails on a lot of social media platforms in the modern age, which pushes towards a hyper happiness and a hyper positivity, hyper success, hyper optimization, and a sort of a relentless performative happiness and a relentless performative wellness, which I have argued before. One, I've made it very clear I don't like it. I have great distaste for that push in that direction, and I've argued that it sort of lends itself to a sort of unhealthy fanaticism, an unhealthy obsession, and a sort of a misunderstanding of kind of the sovereignty of self, that I feel is very still often massively connected to, and I mean I argued this the other week, I think still massively connected to very conventionally capitalist ideas of progress and capitalist ideas of success and arrival, and it's it's often about accumulation of experiences. It's often about the achievement of goals. So very goal oriented, which to me always takes us away from the present and being present. And so, one of the things my cousin and I were discussing yesterday was the idea of the leaning into the idea of the abandonment of self and the real kind of giving away of self, the letting go of self. And as I put it to him, I was saying it's almost like you're willingly bringing in a disintegration of self, a disintegration of that matter, like dust in the wind, and you're just throwing it up into the universe and offering yourself into the great sort of universal life force and universal energy, just to be a part of the matter of existence. And within that, there's an anonymization. You're rendering yourself anonymous. You're bringing yourself into a non, and this is not said in a negative state, but you're bringing yourself into nothingness, into a very non-specific state where you're focusing on just existence. I exist. The matter of me exists. And that is perhaps, that is a path. That is a path to not being stuck in a place of angsty self-examination, which arguably, we can say, the great we of me, I, the podcast, Dara, what I do on this show is often in that territory, but I'd like to think it's coming from a place of calmness, of non-ego, I think. It's tricky. I mean, I'm trying to walk this line, but I mean, the nature of, someone who has, weekly put out a podcast that is massively an exploration of self, and then say, it's not about the self. There is a contradiction there, which I accept, and I haven't quite worked out how to articulate that contradiction in a way that I feel happy with. But in any case, that's all preamble, because what I was going to argue, what I am arguing, is that whatever about this idea, this very, as I say, this very kind of Buddhist, Eastern way of thinking, to say we can just remove the self from the picture and through that achieve, I don't want to use the word enlightenment, because that sounds very grandiose, but through that removal of self, we arrive in a place of existential acceptance rather than existential torment, I suppose. And that to me sounds more attractive. But in spite of that being a very valid offer, a very valid suggestion, a very valid approach, and as I say, I think something that is ultimately very desirable to allow us to just kind of sit in a different place with ourselves. The fact remains that we are endlessly interested in self, and we're endlessly interested in the depiction of self. We're endlessly interested in the depiction and representation of the individual and of what an individual does and what world revolves around an individual, and how an individual reacts and responds and determines in that world in which they find themselves. And I'm reflecting on this in terms of how many stories and how much art revolves around the individual character, and even throughout history. How much history is like how much of the I won't say history, but rather the recording of history, and so within the great historical record throughout the history of human existence, as long as we've had the capacity to document the stories and accounts of great individuals have been legion. And that's still a dynamic and still a mode of human storytelling and a mode of human understanding and human representation that we're all drawn to. And it's across the board. It's across the arts particularly. But it's still something that we instinctively recognize. And I guess in terms of historical figures, it's often in a frame of exceptionalism, because often it's, history often tells the story of singular figures and of leaders, or the great villains. If we take the narrative of dictators and the 20th century dictators, and I think if you reflect on the Russia-Ukraine conflict at the moment, the figures that we're going to talk about are probably going to be, of course, Putin and Zelensky. I've got his name right, haven't I? The Ukrainian president, who are both behaving in very singular ways, for better and worse. But I'm going to focus today, for the rest of the podcast, I want to focus on 3 movies that I watched over the weekend, my Friday, Saturday and Sunday night viewing, because I thought they're actually great illustrations of this idea of self-centered movies, like a movie that focuses on the individual and the individual's journey. I mean, not all movies do this, but many do. And I'm looking at 2 that are superficially connected and one that's quite different. But basically, they all lean really heavily into the individual's journey and the individual's experience, and they are 3 great performances by the actors involved, very evocative and intriguing and fascinating characterizations, with very different things going on in their lives and different drivers, if you will. So let me just get on with it then. So the 3 movies I watched over the weekend were, in order, on Friday night, having not seen it for maybe 20 years or more, I watched all of these on Netflix, incidentally. So sometimes we can feel like there's not a great range of stuff there to watch, because they pop up the same offering on your home screen all the time. But I watched Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver from 1976 on Friday night. On Saturday night, I watched Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette from 2006. And last night, I watched the Safdie brothers' Good Time from 2017. And they are 3 absolutely distinctive movies. One, at least, Taxi Driver, is, an absolute classic. It's guaranteed its place in the canon of great movies. just a phenomenal achievement of Scorsese bringing Paul Schrader's script to life on screen, with a sort of a definitive young Robert De Niro performance. Just a haunting, chilling, visceral piece of work, that also brought us into with much greater with a much sort of greater screen vision and much greater sort of screen accomplishment of Martin Scorsese's than his earlier Mean Streets, which the blueprint was there. The blueprint was there, the sort of the New York kind of underworld, sort of fringe players of the underworld, fringe players of the kind of the crime world. But those Italian American guys coming up, guys on the make, ducking and diving, bobbing and weaving, all that kind of stuff. Where in Mean Streets, Harvey Keitel was really the focus of that story, and De Niro was the kind of the out of control wild boy, the kind of the secondary character, and then that flipped, and De Niro became the guy. De Niro became Scorsese's guy, and it's his world that we're brought into in Taxi Driver, and it's one, watching it now, you might be struck just by how youthful De Niro looks. I think at that stage he's playing, I think, 26 or 27 in the movie. He might have been in his early 30s at that stage. But he was really quite a small guy, like a small, wiry guy. And he looks, at times he just looks really good. He looks like that classic good-looking screen idol. And then he can just flip. We see this other side that is kind of unnerving. It's kind of gawky and a bit gormless and goofy. And later, of course, very, very, very chilling in terms of what plays out. But basically, just to give you a recap of what Taxi Driver is about, if you haven't seen it, it's the story of a war veteran named Travis Bickle, played by De Niro, and he is, now we'd kind of go, okay, he's got PTSD, and he is sort of desensitized to life. He has insomnia, he can't sleep, and he is really, if it hadn't already been in his makeup, he is demonstrating a sort of a sociopathic leaning, a failing to recognize boundaries, a failing to recognize normal human interactions, or to put them into a frame that we would understand, relating to what is and isn't appropriate, and someone who is really listening to his own track and stuck on his own click track in his head, and in a way that keeps him just sort of out of the loop and out of the conversation, out of the natural flow of interaction with others. But basically the movie starts and he gets a job as a taxi driver because he can't sleep at night, so he wants to do work long hours and get through the nights. And the story really of the movie is his kind of unraveling, I suppose, and his sort of disintegration, or his descent into sort of fatal action, brought about by his own desperation, his own inability to to achieve a sense of control over the world in which he finds himself. And in this particular movie, and it's become it's a cliche. It can be a cliche of movie criticism, but it's very evident here. You're looking at a pre-gentrified New York, and like I would certainly remember that as a kid, like depictions of New York. And two movies come to mind, which I've mentioned before on the podcast: The Warriors and Fort Apache, the Bronx, both sort of early 80s movies set in New York and presenting New York as a sort of urban hellscape of, drug addicts and prostitution and social decay, moral degradation, entrenched sort of cynicism, evident fear and danger and electricity. New York as a sort of a horrorscape. And in The Warriors, that's presented, that's kind of hyped up because we were brought into the world of street gangs with, different colours and masks and costumes and whatnot. But that was very much how kind of New York, I guess, on one level was in the, late 70s or the 70s and early 80s. And it felt gritty, it felt scary, it felt real. And Taxi Driver is very much in that place as well. It's the nightlife, particularly, that De Niro's character Travis Bickle experiences in his taxi, and there's an edginess, there's a messiness, and it feeds into his sense of alienation and his sense of disgust and disdain and his sense of wrongness, like the sense of this, this is a messed up world. But then what we see in his daytime activity is he is drawn to a campaigner for a presidential candidate, a beautiful campaigner in white, a young Sybil Shepherd. And he sees her and he approaches her, and he is persuasive and charming because he's kind of speaking a language that's coming from his place of being misunderstood and his place of not being able to identify or relate. And he speaks to her and sort of goes, I can see you're lonely, I recognize something in you. And she's taking it at face value and is kind of seduced by it. And then on their first date, their first proper date, like they go to have a coffee first, but then he takes her out and brings her to an adult cinema to watch a pornographic movie. And he's completely bemused when she walks out after, within minutes of the opening of the movie, and he doesn't understand why she's offended or uncomfortable. And it's a bit of a breaking point for his character, and it really is the final thing, the straw that breaks the camel's back, the tipping point, and he determines to take action. And the other female focus of his attention in the movie is Jodie Foster as a child prostitute who is under the care of Harvey Keitel's virile, slippery, kind of dancing pimp, who is just this kind of extraordinary street creation who is mocking De Niro's character when he's first approached by De Niro. But ultimately, De Niro sets about on a mission to liberate Jodie Foster's character, and it all comes to sort of a bloody conclusion. And in the mix of all of this, or in the backdrop, is the story of the presidential candidate's campaign, and that journey of a public representative trying to get elected and trying to speak for the people or to convince the people that he is the right man for the job. And, De Niro's character tapping into, what is this journey? What is this journey of salvation? What is this journey of rescuing the country? Is this guy the great white hope? And De Niro's character ultimately sets himself on what he's trying to. He wants it to be a sort of a suicide mission of destruction of this street life that he has such disgust for, and yeah, it's just a brilliantly told story, and it's atmospheric, it's creepy. De Niro's performance, possibly one of his best acting performances, really, because it kind of keeps it in a very real place. It's not as broad as his Jake LaMotta, and that vocal cadence that De Niro has, which can be quite dead and quite lacking emotion. And I spoke about this in his character in The Deer Hunter, when I was arguing he doesn't make a great lover in the movies, because he's almost too remote and too detached and too internal. But he uses it to such brilliant effect in Taxi Driver, and he is a chilling, fascinating, slightly terrifying character who, in a way, watching it now, whatever it is, 45 years, 46 years later, it's amazing how resonant the story feels. That sense of nihilism, and the sense of disenchantment and alienation, and the sense of the whole world is going to hell, so I've got nothing to lose. I think that's a very resonant feeling, and it's a very resonant kind of depiction of an experience and of a perspective in 2022, and so really, in many ways, like Travis Bickle, that character as written by Paul Schrader, who's a great Paul Schrader throughout his career as a writer and a director. He comes back to again and again and again the individual male actor, the male agent who is struggling with his internal conflict, who is struggling with his pain, who is struggling with his inability to make sense of it all, and his inability to adjust or adapt or assimilate. And throughout Taxi Driver, we have De Niro's voiceover from his character's diaries, and he famously refers to himself as God's lonely man, and that is really it's a Schrader archetype at this stage, and it's one he's returned to again and again. Most recently, in last year's The Card Counter, with a brilliant performance by Oscar Isaac as again, like the De Niro character, a war veteran who is struggling really to come to terms with his shame and his guilt. And ultimately, The Card Counter, though set in the world of small town casinos, it's the story of atonement and an attempt at redemption. And it features a couple of nice performances from Tiffany Haddish and Ty Sheridan as well, and also Willem Dafoe in a very key role. So Schrader, very much set the template with Taxi Driver all those years ago, and is still writing scripts, that are very much centered on God's lonely men. Let's use his own language. So that was Taxi Driver. And yeah, as I say, an amazing evocation of the tormented self. And in fact, that nightmarish evocation of torment and psychopathological descent and unraveling, that explosion of psychopathic violence, that is the climax of the movie, was so visceral and disturbing that the legendary film critic Pauline Kael almost yelped in horror as she watched. Pauline Kael really was a key film critical voice who, with her review of Bonnie and Clyde, announced with great authority the arrival of the new Hollywood post Easy Rider, I suppose. Easy Rider is considered the movie that really started that creative revolution that broke the studio system and ushered in this American, like an American echo of the French Nouvelle Vague, the French New Wave. And Pauline Kael was one of the key voices, and that review of Bonnie and Clyde was a seminal text in sort of understanding the new Hollywood aesthetic, the new Hollywood voice, the auteur imprint on new Hollywood movies of the 70s. And Taxi Driver was very much in that vein, and her reviews are key texts for anyone who's interested in movies of that time. And I'll include in the description to this episode her original review of Taxi Driver. I was looking for it online and found it on a nice website that gives a nice little preamble and kind of sets the scene for the review. And it brought to my attention again that Pauline Kael didn't have a great relationship with Paul Schrader, so she barely gives him credit for Taxi Driver, really focusing her praise more on Scorsese's achievement rather than what Schrader achieved and what he created with that script. So well worth a look. If you're enjoying listening to this, go and click on that link in the description and check out Pauline Kael's response from the time. It's really fascinating stuff. So the next thing. The following night, I went to Sofia Coppola's 2006 movie Marie Antoinette, and Kirsten Dunst plays the titular character. And I don't know why I didn't watch it at the time. I mean, I'm not a diehard Sofia Coppola fan, but the couple of movies of hers I've seen, I've liked. The Virgin Suicides was her debut, which I loved. Kirsten Dunst was in that as well. Of course, she did Lost in Translation, the Bill Murray, Scarlett Johansson drama, romantic drama, life. I really liked that movie. It was a real kind of moment, it felt, at the time. But I hadn't seen much else of Sofia Coppola's. But this one, Marie Antoinette, is just a visual feast. And before I talk about Kirsten Dunst's performance, the sense of composition, Sofia Coppola's sense of composition, her sense of mise en scène, the arrangement of the images on the screen, and where she kind of puts the camera and how she arranges things. It's painterly. I mean, there are just some moments in that movie that just go, oh my, just the way the light has been captured. And I didn't stop to look up the cinematographer, but they obviously deserve massive credit as well. In fact, I'm going to quickly give them a reference because it feels wrong not to. But yeah, colour and light, and just the aesthetic the aesthetic delight of that movie is, it's just something to be immersed in. Absolutely beautiful to look at. And the cinematography was by Lance Accord. Never heard of him actually, but there you go. So Lance Accord definitely has a lot to be thanked for, and KK Barrett was the production designer for that movie. But really, just just absolute immersion in beauty and loveliness. And they were allowed to shoot in the Palace of Versailles, and they do it to great effect. And what's also then, what I think, what Sofia Coppola brings to that, because we can think about historical dramas and we can think about period dramas, and often they can be a bit staid and a bit stuffy and a bit dry and humorless and stiff, and that's just not her bag. And she brought that, she brought a similar quality to The Virgin Suicides, her adaptation of the Jeffrey Eugenides novel, when she made her mark. But there is something, certainly in the movies of hers I've seen, she is great at evoking a sense of atmosphere and texture, and bringing us into the sort of the interiority of her characters. And it's something about the way she uses sound as well. They seem to me to be very hourly, calm kind of movies. Now, that said, she also likes to use music, and she brings in what are more, what are often commonly referred to now as needle drops, where she takes pop songs, contemporary pop songs, or known pop songs, punk songs, and drops them into the soundtrack. And so she does that sort of incongruously in Marie Antoinette to great effect, because ultimately I think her position, if based on the movie, is to remind us that Marie Antoinette was this Austrian princess who was betrothed to, I think it's Louis XVI, hilariously played by Jason Schwartzman in Marie Antoinette, as this kind of doofusy, callow Egypt of a French prince who, doesn't really he's just so ill-equipped to be a husband, so ill-equipped to perform his husbandly duties, particularly in the attempt to sire an heir to the throne. And what we're reminded of is, Marie Antoinette was, I think she was 14 when she was married, in this attempt to broker a strong political relationship between Austria and France. And I think what Sofia Coppola is doing is bringing us into that world of, a young woman, a teenager who has come up through the aristocracy, understands her obligations, her duties, what she's expected to do, but is massively in touch with her adolescent fascinations and obsessions and whims and caprices, and just beautifully played by Kirsten Dunst in this kind of souffle of a performance that I think this is her kind of great gift. It's not in any way empty, because that's her quality as an actress, is that she is, I think, very believable, and there's an intelligence sort of simmering. Not necessarily, she doesn't necessarily place it in a very intellectual, heady, I'm smarter than everyone, like just her emotional intelligence and her ability to bring the sort of the internal pulse of the character, that person, that their personality is very much present at all times. And And yet her journey through the movie is one of, okay, well, my young husband is not really doing his duty in bed, and we're failing to make a baby. Well, I'm going to get on with enjoying the riches of my role, and I'm going to enjoy the parties and the public occasions, and I'm not going to be held back. And Kirsten Dunst and Sofia Coppola, I guess, conspire to go, she isn't presented as being, malicious or, selfish in a petty, insecure or egomaniacal way. It's more, she seems to be, their decision was to go, she came into this with no guile. She came in with a sort of an openness to the experience and a kind of a great appreciation and a great willingness to enjoy the benefits that came with the place she found herself. And ultimately it's like a teen movie at times, when she has her besties around her and they're buying beautiful shoes and eating beautiful cakes. And as I say, you should check out this movie just to enjoy the visuals, even if you don't find the story particularly compelling. But I think it works. It worked for me, and it's fun, it's frothy, it's witty, and it taps into something. I think it taps into something believable and relatable, and we do experience it. We do experience it through, again, this vivid self that is Marie Antoinette, as presented by Kirsten Dunst, and the world in which she finds herself, and with some great sort of supporting roles. Marion Faithfull as her dedicated mother back in Austria, Danny Houston as her brother drops in momentarily, probably most memorably Judy Davis, the great Australian actress, has a wonderful role as the sort of almost mentor figure within the French court, who is instructing the young Marie Antoinette about the do's and don'ts and all the decorums and etiquettes that must be observed. Judy Davis in this kind of, her character is kind of excruciatingly kind of awkward and pained at all times to ensure everything is being done the correct way. Rose Byrne, another Australian actress incidentally, she drops in about midway through, and there's a great injection of energy and fun and frivolity and silliness with her, that I think her character gives Marie Antoinette permission to just go for it. It's done really well. Oh, and Rip Torn. Rip Torn is very funny as the king's father, this sort of lascivious, drooling scoundrel who has his courtesan, his mistress, in court, to the disgust of everybody else. He's very good also. And Steve Coogan, the English comedian actor, he's very good in it, really solid. But I think the funniest thing about him in the movie is his extraordinarily hideous haircut. At one point, we see him without his wig or his hat, and it's something to behold. He's like a butchered poodle, but really fantastic and well worth a watch. I think very, very sort of, you get that sense at the end. The movie travels to its natural end point, which is the collapse of the monarchy, the collapse of the aristocracy in France. The storming of the Bastille is reported, and Marie Antoinette, again in terms of the story, kind of heroically stays by her man in their palace and the kids, while the mob gathers outside. And the closing scenes, I thought we were going to end with the guillotine, but in a way, I was relieved that that wasn't Sofia Coppola's choice, although we're left in no doubt as to where it's going to end. But it's quite a judicious, melancholy ending. And yeah, just really nice. And it was funny, I was thinking about it this morning. If you're talking about the young performer playing this distinctive historical figure, it made me jump back in time to Tom Hulce in Milos Forman's Amadeus, his Oscar-winning biopic of Mozart from 1984. And I remember seeing that as a kid and thinking, wow, what an amazingly electric performance by the young Tom Hulce. I'm not sure. I haven't watched that in a long time, and I'm not sure how well the Tom Hulce performance has aged. Mostly what I remember from it now is his high-pitched laugh as the young genius composer. Probably F. Murray Abraham as the embittered lesser composer who's languishing in Mozart's shadow, Salieri. His is probably the more memorable part, and his kind of bitterness and delight at Mozart's ignominious end. But I'd have to rewatch it. I think, is it Don Giovanni that's used to great dramatic effect in that movie? But yeah, maybe they're good companion pieces. Lives in the kind of the European courts, and two great youthful performances. But as I say, I'm putting a little asterisk beside Tom Hulce's performance. I'd have to go back. I'm not sure how well it has aged. Incidentally, the English actor Simon Callow, he portrayed Mozart in the stage production of that script, because I think it was I'm going to go blank. The playwright's name, wasn't it the same playwright who did Equus? Is it Peter Schaeffer? Did he do the play of Mozart, of Amadeus, for the stage? And Simon Callow played him on stage, and he does appear in Amadeus the movie as well as I can't remember what the role was, one of the courtiers or maybe another musical figure. I can't remember. Anyway, blah blah blah. Okay, so the third movie I watched, very interesting, Good Time, from just 5 years ago, 2017, and directed by the Safdie brothers, Benny and Josh Safdie. And they directed a few years ago what I think is just one of the best movies of recent years, Uncut Gems, which focuses on Adam Sandler as this jewel dealer who gets himself in a horrendous situation in an extraordinarily tense, sweaty performance, which is excruciating to go on the journey with him, because he's his own worst enemy. An embodiment of aggressive chutzpah and a neck, and just compulsive, can't stop taking the wrong risk because he's a gambler. And Uncut Gems is just a nerve-wracking ride on the end of your kind of your vicarious kind of wits as you go on the journey with Adam Sandler, who is just getting away with it. You've got to watch that movie, Uncut Gems, which I think is still on Netflix as well. But this was an earlier movie by the Safdie brothers from a couple of years before that, called Good Time. And like Taxi Driver, set in New York, like Taxi Driver, the sort of New York underworld, or if not underworld, that probably overstates it, but the fringes of society, the kind of the disenfranchised, the shut out, the left behind, and what I really like about what the Safdie brothers do is they're not really wasting any time. They're not wasting any time kind of going, let me bring you into the world of these guys. They just go for it right from the start. And the central figure is played by Robert Pattinson, who came to the world's attention really in the Twilight movies as the mopey vampire. Edward, is he Edward? I mean, I remember watching that movie on a plane, the first Twilight movie, going, oh yeah, it's grand, whatever. And then it just became this massive franchise phenomenon. And I think the actor Robert Pattinson, who's English, was just in, he was probably the number one heartthrob for teenage girls all around the world. And I can't remember the other male heartthrob who was in it, who he was a werewolf in the movie series. Is it Taylor something? But of course, Kristen Stewart, not Kirsten Dunst, but Kristen Stewart was Bella, the human who falls in love with Edward the vampire in the Twilight movies. And yeah, like he was a type, the kind of the Byronic mopey the mopey languid lover with alabaster skin, because vampires don't go out to get a suntan for obvious reasons. And subsequent to the Twilight movies, I think Robert Pattinson has actively gone out of his way to seek out edgier, non-conventional, fringe kind of characters who are definitely not in the romantic mold. And Good Time is very much the embodiment of that decision. And basically he is a criminal, and the movie is fundamentally about a bank heist, a bank robbery that ends up going pear-shaped, and his partner in crime is his intellectually disabled brother, played beautifully by one of the co-directors, Benny Safdie. And it's right from the off, and the movie opens with a scene where the brother is in a consultation with a psychologist or a psychiatrist, some sort of psychological health worker, and he's in a consultation, in an interview. And right from the off, I think Benny Safdie, you're just brought into that character immediately. I think it's a brilliant performance, and such a contrast to his performance in Paul Thomas Anderson's Licorice. Am I wrong to say licorice? I mean, I can't get anyone to verify this. I look it up and I'm told licorice. Paul Thomas Anderson's Licorice Pizza from last year. Great movie, as you would expect from Paul Thomas Anderson. He just doesn't miss. And Benny Safdie is in that movie this will draw a connective line to Taxi Driver as well. He's in that movie as a young, progressive, attractive politician, and he couldn't be further from the character that he plays in Good Time, who can barely sort of articulate himself. But yeah, that movie, I mean, I'd almost recommend the movie just to watch his performance, and he features much less. He has much less screen time than Robert Pattinson. But the movie is driven really by Robert Pattinson's attempt to basically get his brother out of custody, out of jail or subsequently hospital, where he ends up, and his attempt to kind of, to liberate him. And it's, again, similar to Uncut Gems, just this sort of, breakneck tale of Robert Pattinson just trying to make the right moves. His character, he is a player, he's a hustler, he's a con man. Incidentally, his character's name is Connie. Maybe that's coincidence, maybe not. He's a charmer, but he's got aggression, he's got edge. And what's kind of beautiful, and I think what's lovely about the movie, is there's also a very evident vulnerability and love and humanity. I mean, he's driven by this love for his brother. even if, how he chooses to try and be the protector or the problem solver is coming from that kind of criminal mindset. The it's kind of got like a Desperate Hours sort of vibe. It's like, my only choices are the wrong choices, but they're the best choices I've got. And it's great. It's a great performance, and what I think is really interesting about what the Safdies do is, unlike Taxi Driver, where Scorsese is really giving us those beautiful, nighttime visions. I'm talking about from a cinematic point of view. Like New York wasn't a thing of beauty to look at. I mean, that was the point. But what Scorsese evokes with the kind of the neon landscape and the neon streetscapes and the kind of the edgy, hustling characters of Taxi Driver's nightscape, including, famously or infamously, Scorsese's own appearance in Taxi Driver as a sort of a psychotic husband who's been cheated on, a kind of a suited up, maybe Wall Street kind of character, who gets Robert De Niro to drive him to where his wife is having an affair, and he's looking up at her through... he sees her shadow in the window. He talks about what he's going to do to her with his gun and where he's going to place it, and it's kind of, okay, Martin, I guess that's what you want to show us. But again, it's a great character, and maybe another kind of, another pebble in De Niro's shoe, so to speak, in terms of going, this city is screwed. But in any case, whereas Scorsese was trying to show us, have a look at the streets, have a look at the lights, have a look at the action, see the people, the Safdies take a very different approach, because their frame is often very small. Their frame is claustrophobic. It's about kind of choices running out. It's about no options, and it's about being squeezed. And it's like they squeeze the screen, so we get a lot of close-ups of eyes and faces and confined spaces, inside a tiny sort of cheap house or apartment, inside corridors, inside alleyways, inside a minibus, and everything's kind of, the walls are closing in, the ceiling is closing in, the rooms are cluttered, the screen is cluttered, the world is cluttered. There are no clean pathways, there are no clean avenues, and Pattinson's character Connie is just, relentlessly pursuing, the options he thinks he has, and he leans on a girlfriend played vividly and kind of tragically and funnily by Jennifer Jason Leigh. But then later he finds himself prevailing upon the kindness of strangers with whom he's shared a minibus with who he thinks is his brother, and he ends up sort of, impulsively and desperately seducing the teenage daughter so she can't see his criminal face being paraded across the TV news station. So he's just electrically alive to the moment and the immediacy of the situation and the immediacy of his choices. And the movie is driven by that, to its, the Safdie brothers don't seem to trade in happy endings. So, it ends, and it ends with Robert Pattinson's character in custody. And I found myself wondering if he was trying to channel Bob Hoskins's final scene in The Long Good Friday. So memorably, Bob Hoskins played the doomed, kind of hubristic gangster. Is it Harold Shand or Howard? Harold. It's Harold, isn't it? Harold Shand in The Long Good Friday, one of the great British gangster movies. And in the end, he's taken down by the IRA, Pierce Brosnan features in that in an early role, before he got his teeth done. But anyway, the ending of Long Good Friday is extraordinary, an extraordinary bit of sort of, face acting, where Hoskins is, they've got him and he's been taken away in the back of a car, and the camera just stays on him as he's just pugnaciously, defiantly, desperately glowering at the guys who've got him, glowering at life, furious and helpless. And it's kind of compelling and chilling, because as those credits roll, you're watching a dead man. And similarly, at the end of Good Time, Pattinson's in the back of a squad car, and we're just looking at his eyes through the grill of the car behind the front seats, and you just see him processing the new reality, processing the new immediacy, and there's glints of humor, of knowing kind of, of course, how, was it ever going to end any other way? This is my lot. And it's I think, again, it's a great individual performance, and it's a great evocation of self, and a guy who is just going for it, and in a radically different way, to De Niro's Travis Bickle. Pattinson's character, he's got interpersonal skills. He's quite charming, and there's a warmth to him, and he has moments, ever so brief, of poise and courtesy, even though he's just pushing this agenda, and he's desperate, and he'll do whatever it bloody takes to get his brother back with him. And I mean, again, and just to underscore the Safdies' sort of sympathy or empathy, their humanistic kind of driver. The film doesn't end with Robert Pattinson. I mean, I think that's the second last scene, with Pattinson looking through the grill. It actually ends with the brother back in care, back with the psychiatric person, or the psychologist from the start of the movie, and he's brought into a class, into a session with other residents, clients, patients with intellectual disabilities, it's actually a very warm ending. There's a sadness, because Benny Safdie somehow brilliantly conveys the sadness of the character, and there's a certain kind of broken-heartedness there, and it's just lovely. Actually, it's just lovely. So it's it's a movie I wouldn't hesitate to recommend. Those three movies, an interesting trio: Taxi Driver, Marie Antoinette, and Good Time, and they're all there on Netflix. So there you go. This is my big plug for Netflix. Well worth checking out, and it's just to remind us that no matter what we can say philosophically, existentially, psychologically about whether the primacy of self, or trying to base our wellness frame on self, whether that's worthwhile or not. Personally, I think it's a kind of a two-tiered approach. I think there's great benefits to be had from doing the work on yourself, in terms of if you've got trauma to unpack, if you've got stuff you still haven't worked through successfully, if you're aware of certain patterns that aren't helping you. I think do the work to get help, to seek help, to get yourself to a happier place with yourself. And it's then when it can be easier to let yourself go, to not be so focused on the great I, and you can be released to engage with life in a very different way, where you can be much greater empowered, I would say, by not being anchored to working yourself out. And this is, this, I don't think this necessarily has to be a youthful concern. I think there's always a place for learning. There's always a place for understanding ourselves better. There's always a place for changing patterns and walking into a better space in our lives. I don't think that ends. I don't think it has to end. I hope it doesn't end. And I think that is very connected to being present and being alive to who we are and where we are and who we're with and what we're doing, and making that decision to get on with it and to engage with life to the fullness of our ability, and to make active decisions, even if that's the active decision to detach or remove or to power down. They're all good choices too at the right time. They are great choices. So I'm going to power down now. I've got a Tai Chi class to teach, and I'll be back next week. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Very, very movie focused, story focused, character focused, but there are 3 characters, I don't think you'll regret spending time with. Steel yourself, though, if you're going to watch Taxi Driver. It's a bit of a rough ride. Okay, you can throw me some love on social media. A couple of people have recently, and I am grateful. Thank you. Thank you for that love on social media. The Clear Out podcast is on Instagram. It's on YouTube. It's on Facebook. The Clear Out 2, that's the digit 2, number 2, is on Twitter. And you can email me, should you care to, at theclearoutlive@gmail.com. And if you want to support the podcast financially, throw a few euros my way, you can do so using the supporter link wherever you're listening to the podcast, or you can become a regular patron of the show using patreon.com/theclearout, and just throw me the price of a cup of coffee once a month or once every couple of weeks, and that would be wonderful. Otherwise, spread the word, bump it on, pass it on to someone you think might enjoy it, and I'll be back. I'll be back next week with more. Okay, thank you so much for listening. I do appreciate it. You take care of yourselves out there. Watch out for the individuals, and don't forget, you're an individual too. Okay, mind yourself. Take care. Bye.